segue from one zoonotic infection, CE, to the next. And so I'm so pleased to introduce to you today Joel Hagstrom. And Joel is in the joint MPH-PA program. And so, of course, by the time those students are getting assigned to CE advisors, we had never met. So at the beginning of the year, and I'm like, hi. So when you start from that point, you have to start from the basics of, well, what are your interests, and here's what I do. But I think the very first time we met, it was a very natural and quick progression to thinking about this question of leptospirosis. And Joel was such a pleasure to work with, and I noticed that he's extremely organized. So he would come in even a little bit ahead of those deadlines, which was amazing to see, because we know those, how tight those are. But he was extremely thorough, and I know he had, when we started with the topic of leptospirosis, there were many ways that he could go, and he really directed this to thinking about occupational exposures to animals.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Applebaum, and thank you, Dr. Price, for helping us through this whole process. I want to start by saying all the presentations have been great so far today, so kudos to you guys. Hopefully, so like Dr. Applebaum mentioned, today I'll be talking about leptospirosis, which is another zoonotic disease. So it's a spirochetal bacteria of the genus Leptospiros. So what that means is that it's this corkscrew-shaped bacteria. And what I want you to imagine, I've become the pasta guy this year. And it's similar in shape to fusilli pasta, and its modes of transmission are usually in animal urine or infected tissues, usually the kidney or the liver. So I need you to just visualize with me for a second this pot at the top right. The animal is the pot, and within that animal, the pasta is the bacteria. And if you spill that pot for a brief second, you can see where all the pasta is gone. But if you take your eye off it, you've lost track and no longer know where to clean up, what areas to avoid. So it's very hard to track this disease. One of the things that makes it unique is that its symptoms are very similar to the common cold and influenza. So when it presents clinically, if you're not attuned to workers in animal populations, you can misdiagnose it and leave it undertreated. And if it's left untreated, it can develop into pulmonary hemorrhage, which is bleeding into the lungs that prevents respiration, which subsequently leads to death. So I know what you're thinking right now. Who gets the most fusilli? So based off us knowing that animals are the vectors of transmission for this disease, it was reasonable to want to investigate the occupations where individuals are regularly in contact with animals on a daily basis. And those professions include things like veterinarians, slaughterhouse workers, and farmers. So what we currently know is that leptospirosis kills 59,000 people across the globe each year. And to put that in perspective, if you've ever been to Capital One Arena, it holds 19,000 people. So you would be able to fill the arena to capacity 3 times every year with people who are going to die from this disease. So it's pretty serious. We also have evidence of disease through medical records as well as previous studies. And the WHO has specifically highlighted that specific populations are at elevated risk for coming down with this disease, although it's not very specific with whom. But they've speculated that the highest mortality is in countries that are unable to produce evidence of the burden itself. So these low and middle income countries that don't have the funds or research capabilities to say it's actually worse here. So the reason why I thought this was super important is because studying within the EOH department, we all appreciate how important worker safety is and believe that it's a fundamental right to have a safe working area. So that was one of the reasons why I was inspired into this area of study. So then going forward into the study question, I was focusing on adults and children working with animals, and I chose not to discriminate by country income level because the variety of studies that I was seeing, what you needed to be all-encompassing and what we were including. So that was how I came up with that population. And the exposure itself was the occupation of working with animals, while the comparator group were individuals in the same animal occupation that weren't directly involved with the animals on a daily basis, as well as in the immediate geographic locations as well. And then the outcome was a diagnosis of leptospirosis or the presence of leptospira antibodies. And we actually have very reliable means of detecting previous infections of leptospirosis through microagglutination tests and things like ELISA, if you guys have ever heard of that, enzyme-linked immunosorbent assays, which is a mouthful. So we have means of actually measuring these outcomes. And then as we've mentioned throughout the day, the navigation guide provided the systematic methodology that was used for conducting this literature review with the general steps outlined above. So I searched Scopus, PubMed, and Web of Science with the following selection criteria. I felt it was very important to have measures of association or indicators of prevalence for the purpose that in this synthesis of all the literature coming through that we would be able to find trends and actually make valuable conclusions. And then I also had specific inclusion and exclusion criteria that I'll talk about in a few slides. So I wanted to include this graphic not to confuse you at how many words are on the slide itself, but to show you the funnel-shaped sort of progression that the navigation guide places us through. So when we're assessing the risk of bias, it feeds into the quality of evidence and the strength of the evidence, which adds to the systematic rigor of the study itself when reviewing all of the studies. So keeping those methods in mind, let's talk about the results that we got from actually looking at the studies. So the initial search terms and everything that I included yielded 317 individual records, which was reduced to 265 after duplicates were removed. My exclusion criteria, which are a little off-center, but that's okay today, were if exposures to leptospirosis were not occupationally based, so if they simply just talked about leptospirosis and didn't attribute it to an occupation, and also if the occupation that they were discussing did not directly involve animals. Additionally, if cases of leptospirosis were not reported in humans or solely reported in animals, the study was also discluded. So they could have a combination of animals and humans, but there always had to be human subjects. And studies were finally excluded if there was no measure of association, incidence, or prevalence reported. So based off all of those exclusion criteria, we ended up with the final 14 studies. So to orient you to this graphic, on the left side are all of the studies that were included in the review, and the top are the categories that were assessed for the risk of bias. The legend indicates that the green studies that were shaded in green generally had low risk of bias, while studies in red had a higher risk of bias. And there's a couple of key takeaways from this graphic. 12 out of the 14 included studies could not be assessed for blinding because they were cross-sectional in their design, but Dorji et al. And Tabibi et al. Were retrospective cohort and case control studies respectively, so they were the only ones that could be assessed for blinding. Additionally, Maj et al. 2012 was probably high risk for confounding because it failed to mention any controlling of confounders in its analysis. So I thought that was important when reviewing the results from that study specifically. But overall, as you can see, the graphic is pretty green, so it was concluded that there was a low risk of bias. So when talking about the quality of the evidence that came out of these studies, it was rated as moderate, and that was based off an initial rating that was given to human studies. They start out fundamentally as a moderate level of quality of evidence, and there was only one downgrading factor that was due to imprecision. Because throughout the studies, the results were presented in so many different ways, it was very hard to compare across studies, and I thought that while that was a downgrading factor, it wasn't significant enough to lower the quality from moderate. And then overall, the strength was that there was limited evidence of an association between occupational working groups working with animals having an increased prevalence of leptospirosis or leptospira antibodies. So while we started to notice some trends, it would have been too much to say there is sufficient evidence to take action right away. So in the studies that presented their results in terms of odds ratios, we noticed some trends. Behavioral things such as smoking and consuming a liquid, having a water bottle, drinking on the job, not alcohol hopefully, and things like cleaning the offal, which are the internal organs of an animal, so in slaughterhouses that's more common. Those were all shown to be statistically significantly associated with increased odds of leptospirosis. But it's important to note that the confidence intervals are incredibly wide, and that was a limitation because in the study that came from was a very small sample size, so you would almost expect that. And then in terms of protective effects, we would see that washing hands after work and using protective aprons were able to statistically significantly protect people from coming down with this. And washing hands is important because it shows a disruption in the hand-to-mouth behaviors that were occurring with smoking and consuming liquid. And it adds another level of difficulty when trying to come up with interventions because not only are you trying to prevent leptospirosis from being within the animal population, you're working on behavior change and hygiene to also start protecting workers. And what we also noticed is that the annual prevalence of leptospirosis ranged between 0.07 and 1.6 per 100,000 people. So it seems relatively low, but there was quite a spread across studies. And males were 12 times more likely to contract the disease, but this was potentially due to the fact that there's a higher percentage of men just in this working operation anyways. And then in the studies that commented on occupation as the specific source of infection, there was a huge range between 30 and 88%, which speaks to that imprecision that I was mentioning earlier. And I wanted to include the most at-risk groups that were across studies. And I wanted to start by talking about the sheep abattoir workers, which as we just learned were a slaughterhouse. And the reason why I thought that was important is because the method of disease transmission was unique in comparison to the other studies, and the fact that it was transmitted via infected tissues like the kidney and liver that I mentioned earlier, and not that normal and more common urinary route that I discussed. And additionally, sewage workers were also in one of the most high-risk groups, which confused me at first, but then thinking what inhabits the sewers are rats. And rats are one of the most common vectors of transmission for leptospirosis, and because they reside in the tunnels and frequently urinate there, workers who are regularly down there are more exposed to this source of bacteria. And I thought it was interesting to highlight that Fox 5 local news had pointed out that DuPont Circle has a rat problem, and therefore I think it ties the issue closer to home. It's not this foreign third world disease, it's things that we can be exposed to right in our own neighborhoods. So the strength and limitations of this review, I thought the strength resided in the systematic nature of the review itself. And although the results were presented in a variety of different ways, there were overall consistent findings showing that people who did regularly work with animals were making up at least 1/3 of leptospirosis cases that were reported. And then I felt similarly to what I mentioned earlier, that one of the limitations was the cross-sectional design of so many studies, because we know that they're notorious for having issues with temporality and establishing that cause and effect relationship. And one of the biggest ones that came out of the woodwork was talking about geographic location and weather patterns. There have been a ton of systematic reviews that focus on climate and climate change impacting leptospirosis, because specific countries that have higher seasons of rainfall see spikes in cases of leptospirosis during those seasons because the disease is transmitted more easily in wet environments. So that's another factor that needs to be taken into effect later. So we've made it to the point in the presentation where we have stock images about fixing gaps. If you didn't think we would get to talk about construction today, that we do have changed your mind. So like I just discussed, one of the major issues of the study was the cross-sectional design and the issue of temporality. And I also noticed that the specific sources of infection also needed to be determined. So while they focused on more behavioral means of transmission and infection, I think they needed to go into deeper detail about occupational specific variables, including job duties and locations of the jobs themselves. So I believe that future studies need to be prospective and non-cross-sectional and focus on measures of association. So in an ideal world, I would love to see a prospective study where they have baseline monitoring to see if there are presence of antibodies with periodic monitoring to see that even if they're not clinically diagnosed cases, are these workers contracting it, and can we more specifically locate it to the occupation that they're working in. And I also think that it's important that these studies begin happening in areas with the highest burden. So in these low and middle income countries that have been unable to produce evidence of disease burden, seems like it would be a pretty good starting point. So tying it all together and addressing the PICO statement outlined earlier, there was limited evidence of an association. And based on that foundation, there's not currently enough evidence to take policy action. But I think it's time that we effectively build this body of evidence with high quality studies so that if it truly is a problem that's disproportionately affecting these workers, we can advocate for change in a very convincing manner. And I think one of the thoughts I want to leave you with is that prevention can save lives if we know what to prevent. Thank you.
Very interesting presentation, thank you. Questions, very small questions. What is the latency from exposure to presentation of symptoms? And then the second question is, you mentioned that the transmission rates are higher during wet or humid periods.
Is the intervention here on the public health side or on the animal health side?
I think both. I think noticing that the trend involved behavioral aspects, such as where you choose to smoke or eat your lunch and those behavioral things, I believe that's on more of a public health and occupational health side. But in terms of preventing these zoonotic diseases from entering the herd and all, I think that's more of the animal health side. So I think it's more of a collaboration on that front.
All right.
All right.